the entire unified command, I offer my deepest condolences to the families. I can only imagine what this has been like for them, and I hope that this discovery provides some solace during this difficult time. Additionally, we've been in close contact with the British and French consuls general to ensure that they are fully apprised and that their concerns are being addressed. The outpouring of support in this highly complex search operation has been robust and immensely appreciated. We are grateful for the rapid mobilization of experts on the undersea search and rescue, and we thank all of the agencies and personnel for their role in the response. We're also incredibly grateful for the full spectrum of international assistance that's been provided. The ROVs will remain on scene and continue to gather information. Again, our most heartfelt condolences go out to the loved ones of the crew. We'll now take questions.
Rear Admiral, can you talk about the delay in reporting the vessel missing and what impact that had on the search?
This was a incredibly complex case, and we're still working to develop the details for the timeline involved with this casualty and the response. And so we'll provide that information.
About the recovery of the body.
James Matthews from Sky News. John, what other debris have you found? And have you found any trace of those who were on it?
So this is an incredibly complex operating environment on the seafloor, over 2 miles beneath the surface. And so the remote operating vehicle has been searching, and it is highly capable. And we've been able to classify parts of the pressure chamber for the Titan submersible. Let me refer to one of my undersea experts here, Mr. Paul Hankin, to talk about the nature of some of the debris.
Thank you, Admiral. So essentially, we found 5 different major pieces of debris that told us that it was the remains of the Titan. The initial thing we found was the nose cone, which was outside of the pressure hull. We then found a large debris field. Within that large debris field, we found the front end bell of the pressure hull. That was the first indication that there was a catastrophic event. Shortly thereafter, we found a second smaller debris field. Within that debris field, we found the other end of the pressure hull, the aft end bell, which was basically comprised of the totality of that pressure vessel. We continue to map the debris field, and as the Admiral said, we will do the best we can to fully map out what's down there.
Thanks, Paul.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
It's a very difficult question to ask, but it will be an important one for the families, of course. What are the prospects of recovering the bodies of the missing people?
So the questions was related. I'm restating the question from the standpoint of sometimes it's hard to hear the question here. What are the prospects for recovering crew members? And so this is a incredibly unforgiving environment down there on the seafloor, and the debris is consistent with a catastrophic implosion of the vessel. And so we'll continue to work and continue to search the area. down there, but I don't have an answer for prospects at this time.
Admiral, it's Tom Costello at NBC News. Is there any suggestion? Sorry, any suggestion at all that the sub itself collided with the wreckage of Titanic, or that instead it might have imploded above the wreckage and then rained down nearby?
So the question was, is there any question as to whether or not the sub collided with the Titanic or whether it imploded above and debris field created from that? So the location of the Titan submersible was in an area that was approximately 1,600 feet from the wreck of the Titanic. I have an expert here that is familiar with that area and can talk about the debris field and what the debris field indicates in terms of where the casualty may have occurred.
Rear Admiral, really quickly, can you tell me when that massive fleet will be called back?
The expert voice is coming up to answer the question.
Thank you, Admiral. So the question is, where does the wreck lie in relation to the Titanic? I didn't hear the Admiral's answer. I think 1,600 feet. Was that correct, Admiral?
Yep, you got it.
So that's off the bow of Titanic. It's in an area where there is not any debris of Titanic. It is a smooth bottom. To my knowledge and anything I've seen, there's no Titanic wreckage in that area. And again, 200 plus meters from the bow, and consistent with the location of last communication for an implosion in the water column. And the size of the debris field is consistent with that implosion in the water column.
Thanks.
What would cause the question in terms of the timing here? You say that this was a catastrophic implosion, and I know it's early on, but is it your estimation that this happened right at the moment when they lost contact, an hour and 45 minutes after the descent?
So the question was about the timing of the catastrophic implosion. Right now, it is too early to tell with that. We know that as we've been prosecuting this search over the course of the last 72 hours and beyond, that we've had sonar buoys in the water nearly continuously and have not detected any catastrophic events when those sonar buoys have been in the water. So,
can you describe what happens from here, sir, in the next days and weeks in terms of finding any more debris? What happens from here?
So we will, the question was what happens from here, what's the next phase? And so right now, again, our thoughts are with the families and making sure that they have an understanding as best as we can provide of what happened and begin to find some closure. In terms of the large process, we're going to continue to investigate the site of the debris field. And then I know that there's also a lot of questions about how, why, and when did this happen. And so, you know, those are questions that we will collect as much information as we can on now, while the governments are meeting and discussing, you know, what an investigation of this nature of a casualty might look like. This is something that happened, I'll just remind everybody, this is something that happened in a remote portion of the ocean with people from, you know, several different countries around the world. And so it is a complex case to work through, but I'm confident that those questions will begin to get answered.
Is there any suggestion that time factors, speed, anything could have prevented this or saved 5 people on board, or is this quite simply a catastrophic accident?
The question was there any suggestion that time factors may have played a role or consideration in the casualty here. And so the debris field is consistent with a catastrophic implosion of the vessel. Again, while we were prosecuting the search, we had listening devices in the water throughout and did not hear any signs of catastrophic failure from those. And so we're going to continue to investigate, or we're going to continue to document the information there and understand, based on all the information we have, the timeline. So the question was, what are the resources required for the investigation, and which ships will be pulling out and staying in? And so it's too early for me to talk about an investigation. That's a decision that's going to be taken outside of the search and efforts that I was leading. But we do have a number of vessels. We have 9 vessels on the scene right now. We had medical personnel on scene. We had other technicians on scene. And so we will begin to demobilize personnel and vessels from the scene over the course of the next 24 hours. But we're going to continue remote operations on the seafloor. And I don't have a timeline for when we would intend to stop remote operations on the seafloor at this point.
Admiral, as a result of this, do you think there should be changes in the way these are safety rated or inspected so that this won't happen again?
Yeah, the question was essentially about, do you think that there should be changes in safety ratings or inspection for these standards? I know that there's a lot of questions about why, how, when this happened, and the members of the Unified Command, have those questions too, as professionals and experts that work in this environment. And this is an incredibly difficult and dangerous environment to work in out there. But those questions about the regulations that apply and the standards, that's going to be, I'm sure, focus of future review. Right now, we're focused on documenting the scene and continuing the subfloor operation.
We don't know the timing here, but there was the banging noises yesterday that redeployed the ROVs to this area. Is there anything conclusive in those noises, and did that redirection and then finding this debris field today all help?
So throughout the search efforts, we reacted to the information that we had available to us. And while we continue to send it off for deeper analysis. Again, really complex operating environment for us to work in. Let me check with the experts, but there doesn't appear to be any connection between the noises and the location on the seafloor. Again, this was a catastrophic implosion of the vessel, which would have generated a significant broadband sound down there that the sonar buoys would have picked up.
This will be the last question.
Can I just ask you about your comment regarding the families?
That dropped into that ocean today arrived early this morning. It seems that swiftly was able to find the debris field and talk about the speed of that. And also, were all of the assets involved moved as swiftly as possible to the area? And was any help turned away, as some lawmakers have criticized the government?
This was a incredibly complex operation, and we were able to mobilize an immense amount of gear to the site in just a really remarkable amount of time, given the fact that we started without any sort of vessel response plan for this or any sort of pre-stage resources. And so the equipment that was brought on site this morning that we were using was a pelagic ROV capable of operating at 6,000 meters, cameras, sonar, other articulating arms and resources on it. And it, we had to transport it here through C-17 aircraft. This is 2 aircraft that it took to get this up here. And so we've really had the right gear on site and worked as swiftly as possible to bring all of the capabilities that we had to bear to this search and rescue effort. And it was just a huge international and interagency effort to make this happen. So I'm really grateful for all of the responders that came out to support this and really search for the vessel. It is a difficult day for all of us, and it's especially difficult for the families, and our thoughts are with the families today. But this was an immense support, and we had the right gear on the bottom to find it. So thank you.
Will you attempt to recover the bodies, can we ask you, though? The victims, will they be recovered?
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this afternoon. There are no future planned press conferences. Updates will be shared to the USCG Northeast Twitter page, and our staff will be available to take down any questions.
Well, we now know what has happened and the sad news has been revealed, and I'm joined now by former FBI diver Robert Chesson to speak a bit more on this update. Robert, thank you very much for joining us. It seems as if there was a catastrophic failure of the pressurization of the submersible, and therefore that happened at the point at which communication was lost. Do you think that's correct?
Yes, I do, and it's something that I kind of predicted from day one on this. There was only a couple of things that could have went wrong. They could have gotten snagged on something, or it could have depressurized, and you had that catastrophic implosion. Now, because of the phase of the dive that it was in when they lost communication, that is the descent. It wasn't on the bottom, it was still descending, so that means pressure was still building on it. So as pressure was building, if there was a fault, even the most minor fault, this ocean is unforgiving at those depths, and it would have exploited that fault, causing that catastrophic implosion. It's a very likely scenario that I knew from the beginning was likely, although you hold out hope, but that's a very explainable, very understandable event.
And therefore, for the people involved, it would have been very quick, because there was this terrible thought that they were trapped in this submersible with oxygen supplies declining, which just must have been the most awfully frightening thing. But that clearly wasn't what happened.
Of all the possibilities, this is probably the most humane way to end a life. It was very quick, and it was probably very painless. Again, the pressures at that depth are so tremendous that the human body can't withstand it. Certainly that vessel couldn't withstand it. And if it's any comfort at all, it was probably very quick and somewhat painless.
And the issue of the depressurization and of the submersible itself, no doubt people will look into that to see whether it was robust enough, whether it was safe enough. But I think from what you're saying, even the smallest fault could have been catastrophic.
Yes, that's right. I mean, these things have to be tested each time they come back and retested and things like that. So, look, the oceans are very unforgiving. And as you said earlier before the press conference, your comments were dead on. I mean, people know the risks. They take these risks. These people have died climbing Mount Everest. People have died in space, exploring space. This is a human cost of exploration. And those that push the limits often, are the ones to pay that price. And that's what we've seen here. We know more about the surface of Mars. We have Mars rovers all over the surface of Mars than we do about our own deep ocean. So these people are going to places that very few humans have ever gone and very few humans ever will. And there is a benefit to that exploration. There is benefits to knowing what's out there and what's down there. And I applaud, these souls that have now left us because they paid an ultimate price for the betterment of all of us.
Well, I agree. They join the heroic figures of the past who, in the interest of exploration, in the interest of knowledge, have been willing to take these risks. And of course, these risks are high, as we have seen. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Robert. I'm now joined by my panel, founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bastani, and former Brexit Party MEP, Annunziata Rees-Mogg. Aaron, do you think that this is a sad end for heroic people, or do you think that people shouldn't be doing this, that they should let the rovers do it and be more security and safety conscious?
It's certainly a very sad end. And I think people offering political commentary or insights as to how regulation can avert similar things in the future, that can wait for another day. But I do feel that, there was the father and son of the two British nationals who died down there. And there is a lingering thought for me that were these paying customers of this business fully apprised of the risks they were taking? Because the more I've learned about this in recent days, the more my jaw has dropped. This is really akin to sending people into outer space. You don't think about it because 2 miles doesn't sound like very much, but as we found out the hard way, 2 miles under the surface of the ocean is an extraordinarily high amount of pressure, a very difficult environment for humans to operate in. But the questions about regulation and so on can wait for another day.
For another day, and for the moment we need Annunziata to be thinking about the families and the sadness for them. As Aaron's saying, the regulatory issues come later.
You can't really call it a blessing, but thank goodness it was quick. I think I was one of the many people who could think of nothing more terrifying, especially for the father and son, to be just slowly running out of oxygen and knowing they can't get out and they can't do anything themselves, the impotency of that.
And also for the family, the certainty that they've found the wreckage, because there was always the risk that they wouldn't find the vessel, and therefore nobody would know what had happened. I'm sure the certainty is, perhaps not immediately, but will be a comfort for the families in due course.
Absolutely. At the right point in their grief process, there will at least be a closure and a knowledge of what happened. But I think it's extraordinary. I am not an adventurous or courageous person, but I am jolly glad there are some people that are and that do break the mould and take these immense risks, because it does forward humankind and we get to learn new things and move on. And I don't personally have a great interest in the Titanic, but I think the seabed, the new boundaries that we're finding do need to be explored, whether that's AI or what's actually under our feet.
And as you were saying, we've actually learned a lot about this in the last 48 hours, because I'm not sure everybody knew about the extraordinary pressures that there are in the ocean, or the pressure that builds up even as you go down a relatively short distance. But by the time you're 2.5 miles down, the pressures are quite extraordinary. And that is something that we have learnt. So we're being educated even in the midst of a very sad event.
Yeah, and this is something that, how to phrase this, this will happen more regularly because we're at the cusp of an era of exploration, which is not dissimilar to what you were saying with Christopher Columbus, with private space exploration and, of course, autonomous submersibles, people being able to do this more and more. Technologically impossible 20, 30 years ago for a private firm to be able to do what they tried. So park the regulatory questions, because they will exist, but we are at a moment where individuals not necessarily attached to states or supranational organisations like the UN or the EU will be engaging in the kinds of things that we haven't really seen individuals and private firms do for a century or more, really. So very pertinent questions to be thinking about, at least.
And Annunziata, you mentioned the Titanic. The Titanic does have this extraordinary grip upon people's imagination, whatever it is, 112 years on from the disaster. And again, that has led to huge developments and capabilities to do things which, if it hadn't been for the Titanic, people may not have invested in.
Absolutely. I remember watching GBNews a couple of weeks ago when they had those photographs that had just been taken. They've mapped the whole thing and got the photographs of the wreckage. And there is this fascination that drives people to discover new technologies. But sadly, this time there's been an awful price to pay.
Well, indeed there has. The statement from Ocean Gate, which you may not have heard, says that we now believe that our CEO, Stockton Rush, Shahzada Dawood and Suleiman Dawood, Hamish Harding and Paul Henry Najalo have sadly been lost. These men were true explorers who shared a distinct spirit of adventure and a deep passion for exploring and protecting the world's oceans. Our hearts are with these 5 souls and every member of their families during this tragic time. We grieve the loss of life and joy they brought to everyone they knew. Well, this is a very sad occasion, but thank you to my panel. Coming up, it's the other big news story of the day that the Bank of England has raised the base rate by 50 basis points to 5%. And tomorrow marks the 7th anniversary of the victorious Brexit vote, which is sometimes blamed for economic problems which seem to be more global. And finally, we'll be ending on the fact that I am the King's good servant, but God's first. It is the feast day of St Thomas More and St John Fisher, and I will be speaking to Father Alexander Sherbrooke, but that'll all be coming up later.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think. Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Andrew Bailey has a few titles now. Governor of the Bank of England, Chief Ostrich, and perhaps most fittingly for today, Captain Obvious. After having raised interest rates an unexpected 50 basis points to 5%, he addressed the public with this rather feeble statement.
I know this is hard.
He knows it's hard. He's finally developing some understanding of the situation. And as we discussed last night, the bank's failure to increase interest rates earlier, before the pandemic, as well as the latterly superfluous round of quantitative easing, has led to the situation that we are in today. Today's interest rate hike will hit borrowers hard. The sustained period of low interest rates encouraged massive borrowing because one could effectively borrow for free. But now the bank has come back to bite the borrowers. First and foremost, this will hit mortgage holders. The average house price in the UK is £280,000 and the average person borrows roughly 70%. It's about £200,000 over 25 years. So if you break that down, there are 8.2 million residential mortgages in the UK, 1.4 million of which are on variable rates, 6.8 million on fixed rates. This means that the vast number of people on fixed rates rather than variable, every week 35,000 of them switch and will be finding that their rates may be doubling or even tripling. Variable rates go up straight away. So the interest burden will increase for the average borrower coming off a 2-year fixed rate from 2.5% to about 6.2%. If you do that on the average, that's £410 extra a month, nearly 5,000 more per year. Businesses will also inevitably be affected by this, as their debt levels will cause them to pay higher interest rate burdens. Obviously, I want to know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. But joining me now is Eric Hawkins, someone who faces extortionate hikes in his mortgage repayments as a result of these consecutive rate hikes. Eric, thank you very much for joining me. Perhaps you could just say a little about the situation you find yourself in.
Okay, nice to hear from you. Well, we got our mortgage let me think, we came back from Cyprus after 5 years, so it would be 1999. And I've been in business a long time, so I've learned all about problems of mortgages and rates going up. So we took out a mortgage of a new house. We were renting for a year, and the house was about 118,000, and whatever the interest rate was, and I can't remember. But over the years, as my business grew, I remortgaged and I wanted some more money to put in the business. And then by 2009, sadly, again, the banks, like 1990, caused a problem and we went into administration. I think because I'm always into the business of relating to houses, plumbing, heating, bathrooms, that's been my business, then solar energy. And that's all affected, okay, when people start buying houses, they don't want to spend money on homes. So we remortgaged.
So you remortgaged to invest in your business, and now you've found that the interest rate burden is taking up a very high proportion of your monthly income.
Yeah, I'm retired. I mean, I'm 75, my wife's 77, so we've got a state pension and obviously a small private pension. But at the moment, as things go, I mean, our lowest interest rate in 2020, I think it was £272 on 165,000 of loan, and we've got interest only, and it's variable rate. So I've looked at the paperwork today. It looks like the Builder Society puts 1.75% on top of the base rate. So we're now looking at 6.75%, aren't we? Yeah, we would be, yes. So last month's interest, okay, was something like £870. We're now looking towards £1,000 a month.
So you've had
all my income.
You've had an almost fourfold increase in your interest payments since 2020. And that's the key thing.
Pension.
There's a real life effect of these interest rate rises. It's not just theoretical, it's not just affecting the city, it is affecting individual viewers of GB News, Eric, like you.
Absolutely. I mean, I was in the 1990s when, interest rates were 16%. I had a bathroom business and I had 5 or 6 properties I was refurbishing. And I managed to sell the business, okay, for a pittance, lost the freehold and lost my house at the end. And then started again. Hence, I ended up in Cyprus for 5 years just to get away and rethink where I go from here.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening and explaining these difficult circumstances, which I think really explains it in a human way to our viewers. Moving on, tomorrow marks the 7th anniversary of the moment the British people decisively voted to leave the European Union in the largest democratic exercise in our history. 3.5 years on, we finally left the Eurocrats, but it wasn't long before the perfect storm emerged for the resentful Remainiac class to gloat over. As we've discussed before, the pandemic hit and the global economy intermittently shut down for a period of 2 years. And after that came Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Both events posed drastic economic disruption for the world. All of this, along with the Bank of England's rusty monetary policy and our hasty pursuit of the green agenda, has led to the economic turmoil in which we find ourselves. And yet, the Remainiacs entirely blame Brexit. It's almost as if they didn't notice any of the external factors. Well, it hasn't passed me by. We have had some very strong advantages from leaving. We've saved £191 billion from not being in the European Union, from their COVID recovery fund, which they proposed, of about €2 trillion. That would have been our share. Leaving the European Union has granted us the freedom and flexibility to lead the world in supporting Ukraine and actually persuaded the rest of the world to do it, which we couldn't have done if we'd been bound in by sincere cooperation. We developed our vaccine faster than anyone else. We're unleashing agricultural innovation and gene editing technology. Oh, and we've got into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's not just our economy that's having difficulties. Ours is still just about growing. Germany's entered recession. The Eurozone bloc has entered recession. And they didn't leave the European Union to get there. But the number one culprit, of course, is always the chief Austrian governor, former governor of the Bank of England, Mr. Mark Carney, who had the audacity to blame inflation on Brexit. No mention at all of the vast amounts of quantitative easing, printing money, for which he was responsible, despite pledging to stop it on a number of occasions. So, if anyone's wondering if I have any regrets, or regrets for that matter, I definitely do not. I'm now joined by my panel, Aaron Bastani of Novara Media, and former Brexit Party MEP, Annunciata Rees-Mogg, who I may be slightly related to, and also, who has written in defence of Mr. Carney. You've come to the aid of the high priest of anti-Brexiteerism, who got his nose politically involved in politics when he was meant to be an independent governor of the Bank of England, and obsessively blames everything on Brexit.
So I did speak to a number of economists for my article who did say that inflation has been stoked in a small part because of Brexit. What Mr. Carney said was that he didn't sort of solely blame the UK's rampant inflation problem on Brexit. He said it had pushed up inflation a bit. And so I spoke to a few economists who agreed that because of our sort of labour markets being more restricted now, we're seeing these huge labour shortages, and that would have some impact on inflation, for example.
I mean, to be fair to your piece, it was, I thought, pretty balanced, and you didn't blame it all on Brexit. I think Carney likes to blame everything on Brexit, and you're being quite charitable to him. But on the immigration point, we had, what was it, 616,000 people come in last year, including many students who are just the sort of people who can take on hospitality jobs, can serve in bars and so on and so forth, not admittedly from the EU, but it's not as if we've got a shortage of people coming into this country.
No, that's correct, but we do have a shortage of workers. We have employers' organisations sort of calling out for labour quite frequently. I guess the thing to bear in mind with the immigration figures is that a large part of the people coming here at the moment are refugees, or people resettling for humanitarian reasons. So that would be true or from Ukraine or from Hong Kong. And I guess the thing is we don't really know what the employment rate is for these people, but it wouldn't be quite as high as people coming here solely for work.
But hasn't that actually been one of the problems of the British economy? And you mentioned the productivity issue in your article, that we've had a productivity problem that has coincided with mass cheap labour coming into this country. And actually, if we're going to improve productivity, we need to stop this reliance on the drug of cheap labour, which keeps wages down for British people, but also has stopped us getting more productive.
Well, certainly you'd hope now that access to labour is more restricted, that would sort of prompt British employers to think, hold on, is there any way I could invest more to automate some of these processes and be less reliant on labour? Unfortunately, we haven't seen that so far, but that's not to say it won't happen.
Aaron, I imagine you do have a few regrets about Brexit, not something you were advocating. But where are you on the balance of blame over the current economic malaise?
Well, it's interesting you say that they aren't investing in fixed capital to replace workers, but of course, with the costs of borrowing being so high, this is the very last time you want to take big loans to invest in robotics or heavy machinery, which is a bit of a problem.
But they weren't over the last 15 years when interest rates were very low.
Absolutely not. You're absolutely right there. What's really interesting with regards to wage rises is that we see people, very high earners, doing pretty well at the moment. So, for instance, financial services, people are getting really good wage rises. And then people without a university degree also doing really well. So HGV drivers, people picking fruit, welders. Lidl recently gave this great pay rise. I think their staff are now about £13 an hour. So there's an interesting labour constraint going on, which is really good for some people's wages. We should celebrate those workers getting more money. But at the same time, you see net immigration of 600,000. You think, how is that happening? So we're seeing a misalignment between some of the big numbers and then the reality for people on the ground, particularly, like I say, somebody working in Lidl doing really well out of this. In terms of regret. I think clearly Brexit plays some role with regards to immigration. I think it's small. You know, right now I think Poland has about a 13% rate of inflation, rather. Lithuania, Latvia higher. Germany's slightly behind us. So this idea that we wouldn't have high inflation without Brexit, I think, is inaccurate.
And Nunziata, I've always thought one of the great opportunities of Brexit is to get rid of all the tariff and non-tariff barriers to make imports into this country cheaper. We always concentrate on the producer interest, but shouldn't the government be focused on the consumer interest, particularly as agricultural prices are now quite high?
Absolutely, but that's got to include all input costs. When clearly the government are in control of the fact that 54 pence in every litre of petrol goes directly to them. That we've got to think about the whole picture. And removing tariff barriers is very beneficial for the people that do it. It's not just beneficial to the country we're buying from.
And that's one of the key advantages of Brexit, that we are now free to have our own trade deals. We're not tied in to the tariff regime, and more importantly, the regulatory regime of the European Union, if only we have the courage to grasp it.
What I love about Brexit, Jacob, is that if public policy fails in this country, we can blame our own politicians. And that applies with healthcare, economic policy, industrial policy. That's what I like about it.
And this is one of the great failings of our politicians, that I am a Conservative member and supporter, but that we haven't grasped the opportunities to get rid of these barriers to free enterprise.
Well, I'm going to give you the final word. Final thought on this before we go.
Well,
Mark Carney, right or wrong?
I think I stand somewhere in the middle on that. I think he's definitely been a bit too gloomy, but...
Excellent. Well, we can end on a note of agreement. Mark Carney, you're much too gloomy. Thank you, Ian. To my panel, coming up, you'll want to find out why you would have wanted to be beheaded in Tudor England.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Weeknights on GB News from 6 p.m. You'll always get drama.
Please stop, Michelle.
I know, yeah.
Please stop.
Should I just shut up?
Romance.
You like me, I like you. There you go.
There you are. Well, don't tell anybody.
Adventure.
Etc.
That's the whole point.
And action.
Sergeant Green, my superstar panel that are already at it. They're fighting. It's going to be quite a show.
Only on GB News. Britain's watching.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day.
The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Steve, all of these problems caused by the inadequacy of the few, which only impacts the many. Shame on them. That was on interest rates. And likewise, John, after 15 years of punishing savers to avoid hurting borrowers, I'm afraid I have little sympathy. An interest rate of 5% is still low. In a world lacking moral principles that has been dubbed post-truth, now more than ever, we should look back into the past for inspiration. And who better to draw from than Sir Thomas More, whose feast day happens to be today. Sir Thomas More, the patron saint of politicians, was a lawyer and a judge who went on to serve Henry VIII as Lord High Chancellor of England. But More was a man of principle and ultimately resigned in protest over Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and then refused to make the oath to support Anne Boleyn as Queen of England. This eventually cost him his life after a jury, doing the King's bidding, swiftly found him guilty. But the King's final favour was to behead him. As I said, why did you want to be beheaded in Tudor England? Well, the alternative was being hung, drawn and quartered, which was you were trailed behind a horse through the streets, you were then hung by the neck to choke you, you were then drawn, your innards were taken out and burnt in front of you whilst you were still alive, and then you were quartered with your bits hung up over London to indicate that you were a traitor. This happened to many Catholic martyrs, but Thomas More was saved this, as was St John Fisher, whose feast day is also today, who was absolutely unyielding in his principles and sacrificed his life in the name of truth. Fisher was a theologian and a distinguished scholar who was relied upon by Henry VIII, and unlike his contemporary, Thomas More, he lent to support the King's effort to dissolve his marriage. Yet when the sovereign severed ties with the papacy, claiming to be the supreme head of the Church of England, Fisher was resolute against the King. Loudly defying his sovereign, he championed the supremacy of the Pope above monarchical authority, stance that would lead to prison and death. Henry VIII chillingly said, "The Pope may make him a cardinal, but he will have to wear his hat upon his shoulders, for he will have no head to put it upon." So this poses the greater questions of reflection for those of us in the political sphere. Should we draw inspiration from Fisher and More as men of principle and truth? Well, I'm now joined by Father Alexander Sherbrooke, who may have some answers for us. Father, these two great figures, very different in their approaches. More tries to avoid martyrdom. Fisher really tries to go for martyrdom, doesn't he? He lectures the King, he tells the King he's wrong, whereas More quietly says, I won't agree to something, but doesn't actually try to oppose the King.
Fisher was a very humble cleric, a man of great intellect, a man of extraordinary academic career, but he was determined to remain Bishop of Rochester, where he would very diligently visit his parishioners, visit the poor. He lived a very ascetic life, a man of great prayer, great simplicity, but he was the only bishop who did not go with the crowd, and stood resolutely for the faith, for the sovereignty of the Church, against all the popular plaudits of the time.
And he'd been very close to Henry VIII's grandmother, hadn't he? Margaret Beaufort was his great patron, and she also lived quite an ascetic life, with Fisher as her counsellor and confessor.
Indeed. And of course, what you see in that is that extraordinary sense of communion and prayer that would have given him strength for facing down the guillotine, facing down the executioner's axe, or indeed being hung, drawn and quartered, which was how many of our first martyrs went to heaven.
And Thomas More, lawyer, effective politician, actually persecutor of heretics, that he, as Lord Chancellor, did what he could to stop heresy and was not afraid to have some of the early Protestants martyred themselves. But then the King, in his great matter, in his divorce, wants Thomas More's support. He won't give it, but he takes the line that silence assumes consent and takes a very legalistic approach to his situation.
Yeah. Well, remember, of course, that Henry was a great defender of Catholic faith. defender of the sacraments, and as we know, great opponent of Luther. And Thomas was his loyal servant, and he was obviously an inquisitor, not in the impolite sense, but he was given the task of hunting out heresy, but he was commissioned to do so by Henry VIII. But I think what is extraordinary about Thomas is that he was a man of culture, he was a man of simplicity, he was a man of great humility.
But also of humour, because he was a great friend of Erasmus, and Erasmus writes his little book In Praise of Folly, which is... They had a very jokey, informal relationship, so he's not entirely austere saint, which perhaps John Fisher is.
No, indeed, and his language at times was quite fruity.
Well, and he writes Utopia, which is was once on the list of banned books, wasn't it? Catholics weren't meant to read it because it was too racy for us.
And it's quite complicated to understand. I mean, there's a bit of a prefigurement of the Communist Manifesto in it. It is difficult to get hold of. But we always have to remember that Thomas started his life, he wanted to be a priest. He wanted to be a monk, and he lived that life of intense simplicity. And perhaps at the age of 17, 18, he realised that it wasn't for him.
And you've kindly brought in a picture of Thomas More, which I think we can show.
Yes.
In his pictures, he appears to be a very human figure, doesn't he? Whereas, again, Fisher does appear very austere.
And also remember that wonderful duo of Cromwell and More by Holbein.
Yes.
Cromwell looks miserable.
Yes.
Whereas Thomas is full of life and full of laughter. And remember, he had that intense family life in Chelsea.
Which was so important to him.
Yes,
and his family remained very close to him, and his daughter tries to embrace him as he goes to the scaffold.
Indeed, yes.
It's a very moving picture of that.
Yes, yes, yes. His beloved daughter, Meg.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you, Father. We've obviously been talking earlier about the tragedy that has taken place with the submersible and the 5 lives that have been lost. And so I've asked Father to conclude the programme if he will say a prayer for the repose of the souls of those who died on the Titan submarine.
Indeed, and perhaps just to say, Jacob, that there were 3 priests on the Titanic, and they were all given the opportunity of leaving the Titanic, and they remained there to give consolation to those who were going to drown.
Perhaps you could give consolation.
Indeed, indeed. So we pray this evening for those who have lost their lives. We pray that the Lord will have mercy upon their souls. We pray also for their families, their loved ones who mourn them at this time, who will have to deal with terrible tragedy and challenges in the days and the weeks to come. As we say, for those who have died, eternal rest grant to them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. And may their souls and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Father. That's all from us. Up next, it's Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, will you be commemorating Thomas More's feast day?
Yes, and of course also what has been really horrible announcement, which you obviously featured at the top of your show, Jacob, in terms of the Titanic disaster. So we will be covering that, including with a friend of one of the passengers. Also coming up tonight, Lady Colin Campbell on that very dramatic new poll result showing that Meghan Markle is more unpopular than she's ever been.
Well, as always, that'll be a very interesting programme, Dan. It's coming up after the weather. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. This has been State of the Nation, and the weather in Somerset will, I expect, be sunny all weekend.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Increasingly humid over the next few days across the UK. That will translate to hot weather in the southeast, but in the northwest, increasingly wet weather. We see that divide across the UK emerge through the night, with spells of rain starting to arrive into Northern Ireland by the early hours and then pushing into western Scotland. Meanwhile, clear spells elsewhere, although some mist and fog to wake up to on Friday morning because of the increased humidity, and a fairly mild night for sleeping, 16 Celsius, for example, in the capital. Now, we've got that mist around first thing across central and some eastern parts, but it will soon clear. Meanwhile, for northern England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, some cloud and some showery rain. The rain most persistent over north and west Wales, northwest England, as well as western Scotland, turning to showers by the afternoon across Northern Ireland and not quite reaching eastern Scotland.